Hey, this is Vu, and this is going to be a super sick, absolutely incredible advanced guide to DE Mirage. And usually, when you're looking at Mirage, you're thinking about mid control. That's the general way things have always been done, and there's no reason to really change that, especially when you're on the T side. If you're in pugs, you're usually looking at just a top mid smoke, but you may also have a player in your game that's willing to throw a window smoke, and on 128 tick you throw it something like that, holding D as you jump throw, and that'll land directly inside of window. With those two plus a connector Molotov that you can throw pretty easily like so, you can fairly consistently take middle, especially against teams in pugs where they're not really doing a lot of the things that really screw you up. The things that will screw you up are people jumping up cat or people pushing middle, and the most obvious way to deal with those, just to flash high behind as you come out, and with a player that may smoke off your Molotov here and op behind it, the easiest way to deal with that is a flash off of that wall down there that's going to bounce and essentially land directly in front of them if they're trying to hold this angle. With that, you can get a player pretty quickly out to the boxes, and from the boxes it's very hard to aggress on middle because there's so many different angles you can be peeking from, and it's just tough to find anywhere you have an advantage on this player. So as soon as you get top mid boxes control, you're in a pretty good spot. The other thing you want to be thinking about here is what you want to do from getting that control. I talked about in my How to Win on T-Side Mirage video that you want to be making sure you're not just staying up at this top mid box area, this chair area, and the like. You want to be making sure you're actually getting aggressive control. You're getting in towards connector and or towards ladder room. And really, if you have one of the two, the other one should come along naturally. So you're looking at on T side a 1-3-1. The question is often, do you send 3 top mid or do you send 1 underpass? The differences are that with 2 top mid, you're a lot weaker to aggression. If they try and push up middle, you're in a much more awkward spot. However, it allows this player underpass to pressure a player in window to a certain extent. It also allows them to pretty easily smoke off top con and make their way into con. It's a little bit more safe to these types of flash push mid plays that a lot of teams like to do, these re-aggressions. However, if you go 3 out top middle, it's a little bit weaker to the underpass plays, and your B player that's going to be in B apps now has to worry about not only controlling B apps but also checking underpass, which isn't really optimal in its own right, as well as, you know, he's not able to put as much pressure on B, and you don't have that easy smoke bottom con. But what it does allow you to do is allows you to be a little bit more aggressive. You can have players that are quickly swinging even all the way down middle if you want, but quickly swinging to chair, doing something like mollying deep cat, and then flashing a second player who may have pushed through this smoke along the side there, flashing someone into ladder room and going from there. And you can get much more aggressive control of these areas, and you can make sure that you're pushing back the CTs much earlier on the clock than you would if you were going for the standard 1 underpass play. So the differences there certainly can be very significant. How you want to be playing that really depends on, you know, if you're playing with a team, how your team wants to play it. But more often than not, what you're probably thinking about in a pug is you're sending 2 top mid, 1 underpass, because it's just a more simple and easy to play out situation. And once you've got that mid control, the top mid control, again, a smoke con, you can throw it from the underpass side, you can come over here, you can throw it from the top mid side. Doesn't really matter. All that matters is that you're pushing back this player that can easily aim down this line, or the opper up on ticket booth that can also be aiming down the line towards catwalk. So once you push them off of those, they can't know whether or not you're in connector, and if they don't know whether or not you're in connector, they'll have to retake it if they want that information. And retaking connector, usually not something you're looking at as a very successful or consistent play on CT side. So once connector control is gone, usually it's gone for good. The same goes really for ladder room control as well. However, ladder room control is a little bit more attainable late round. You can still clear it out, but it's still not something people are going to be doing on a regular basis. You're not really expecting anything like that. They may just be peeking for information is what you're usually expecting, and usually that's once you've already been putting pressure across the map. So if you push the CTs back off of that mid control, you're in a pretty good spot, and the standard more typical way to play out from there is you regroup up and you go to a bomb site, you execute A with a player in connector just destroying the rotates, and it's very tough to hold. hold. The other option is that you get these more aggressive lines where you actually get a kill towards connector, you make your way quickly up into the bomb site, and you try and quickly split the site. But the other things that teams do quite a bit that you're looking at when you're looking at Mirage is a lot of B pops. One of the things that will often happen when you're going for this type of mid control with the smoke on top cat is this cat player is going to be drawn pretty far forward to try and aggress and control alongside his connector player and alongside his window player. However, if he gets drawn very far forward, that's going to essentially leave this B player, the B apartments player, on an island, and that's why a response oftentimes when a team is playing hyper aggressive on cat is that you quickly set up in here towards apartments. You set up behind the smoke that is very often thrown right about here, and you toss a couple of flashes, maybe one into the smoke that lands in front of someone that's in there, and then maybe you have the last player in line tosses a couple of deep flashes over. So this flash would push him back initially if he's up close, and the other flashes push him back if he's sight, or maybe blind him as he's falling back as well, and you quickly swing out trying to deal with the player in sight and ignore that player on cat because he's going to be rotating back over. One of the other ways, new school, I'm not sure where people learn this smoke from, but a new school way is to actually toss that smoke as well, which will block off that cat rotate so this player can't see window. You can actually see him pretty clearly. He has to get all the way up here to actually clear that out, and this is a much less comfortable engagement, much less comfortable angle, and that can really be a bolster to the B site explosion that you can get things done with. This is also something, if they're not smoking it, a lot of oppers do like to come up here, post on this angle, and try and catch that player jump spotting, and that player jump spotting has become more and more risky and more easy to kill as the map has changed because this lip is so much lower, and especially if you're playing pugs, but if you're playing with a team as well, people often jump spot this very incorrectly. You can get a lot of kills here if they're doing so. The A-side plays that you're usually looking at are a lot more aggressive some of the times, or just straight up executes. You have the straight up execute where you toss a smoke from here towards stairs. You have the CT smoke that can be thrown from many different angles, but I've always preferred this one here, and the jungle smoke that can be thrown from up here that can be thrown I believe like so. And with that, you've got a CT smoke, jungle smoke, stair smoke. You go for the standard execute. There's nothing too crazy about this exec. The only thing that you need to be making sure you're doing is making sure you have, the pop flash from here, the lamp flash. You can throw that. Plus, you can actually throw a flash over that will blind players con or rotating in jungle just as they come in. But usually you're expecting, if you're playing with randoms, you're expecting a couple of jungle or a couple of lamp flashes. And the thing that I always like to make sure is that I want to make sure these players are running out quickly, where you throw those smokes, instantly toss a flash, and you have at least one player ready to swing right away before that counter utility is out, because those smokes will start to come over, people will see it, and they'll toss counter utility, and if you're not past that utility before it gets thrown, that's when things start to go really wrong. You have to wait it out, the rotate's already there, and you're in a really tough spot. So you want to be making sure that you're avoiding that type of thing and avoiding really just getting stuck behind utility on this map. As long as you can be forcing your way out, especially if you have a player Palace that can do something like Molly under balcony, and he can put some pressure out from here as well, then you have a very solid A take, and that's really all the controls you're looking at on the map. The main things you're trying to do on this map a lot of the time are respond to aggressions. You're trying to make sure that you're able to deal with the double ramp push CTs are often going for, a Palace op that pushes up and holds this angle. I mentioned earlier the cat jump or the mid push, or even having an opper up in B apartments that tries to take this angle here, or even, a little bit less common recently, but used to be very common in the past, this one-way smoke thrown here that people can really isolate your B players. So as long as you can really kind of run a default on this map and not have anybody get picked off, you're in a very good spot. The other thing that is to be considered on this map that has really become meta, it did become meta a while back, but pugs really haven't adapted rather to this meta very well, is the idea that you don't always need a B player. Oftentimes your B apartments player isn't really getting too much done. He might come here and throw the Magisk set of utility where he smokes off the window. That one lands a little bit deep. But he smokes off the window, then he'll molly something like Van, maybe toss a flash out as well, and just basically feign aggression and make them worried about that you could be anywhere up in this area. Sometimes players will take this as a duel, take the straight up 1v1, but a lot of the other times this player will be playing a little bit further back, and he'll just be throwing that so that when you go for that B pop, he can throw that and it can give you a little bit more space and push the player on B a little bit further back. Especially what it often does is it may actually pull the cat player away from middle and make your mid control a little bit more easy to execute. But instead of having this player, you can often have this player make his way over towards A. And you have a player on ramp and then you have a player on Palace. And when you have a player ramp and Palace at the same time, if your opponents are soloing A, and that's the objective of this strat in a 2-3-0, I'll call it 2A, 3 mid, 0 B, you're looking at isolating this A player. And especially when it comes to pugs, this A player is usually very easy to isolate. He's oftentimes playing an angle like this, a nice little off angle. He's playing something like default or under Belk. And all of these angles are spots where, as you're putting mid pressure, their con player, their window player, they're unlikely to actually be supporting this player in sight. And once you spot him out, it's very easy to isolate this player and take him down. And that's why often teams are trying to rotate around pretty heavily now between, doubling up on ramp, double pushing Palace. And even there's a response that the CTs kind of know the same thing in reverse. The Ts can know if a CT is soloing A, and they can know that he can be isolated if you go ramp and Palace. Well, the CTs now kind of understand that a 1-3-1 is pretty much standard, and they'll do something like double push Palace, knowing that if the T is in there, they can trade on him, but if he's not in there, they're going to have a pretty good spot because they're well aware that he would then be ramp, and they can try and deal with that however they can. Sometimes they push through Palace. I've even seen teams push through Palace and have two players push a ramp and try and sandwich this player playing ramp when they know for sure he's there, given the information they already have. And it's usually pretty easy to tell when a T side is going for a default. You make some contact in middle and you can already tell exactly what it's looking like. It's not too hard to spot out. So certainly T side control is a lot about getting that default down, getting things to work for you, and then running kind of flavorings of a B hit, a quick B pop, an A exec, things like that. And of course, there is the infamous B rush utility. I'm not exactly sure how to throw all of that utility, but the idea behind this, just to give you an idea, is you have a smoke down here, you have a smoke down here, you have a smoke down here, and you just rush into the site with players swinging pretty wide right off of this angle here down this lane, clearing out all of B, and it's very tough to hold, where the response is very often having this player here drop a Molotov down below the window, then toss a smoke out here, something like this, and try and play around, or they just drop that Molotov down and they spam it or YOLO through the smoke. There's a lot of different options to deal with that, but it's become very well known, it's become very popular because it's incredibly strong. Now, when you look at the CT side is when things get a little bit more complex, things get a little bit more interesting, because there's so many different options on how you can try to hold on CT side now, because there's so many different options for the terrorists. And oftentimes what happens on Mirage is this becomes a bit of a fight for what the meta is, because everyone understands Mirage is a little bit played out now, and the metas have shifted about 5,000 times. So there's definitely kind of semi-counters to a lot of the setups. When you're looking at some teams, they like to play more of a double connector play, op, top, con. They might play a player in connector, and they really fight for control of connector as much as possible and for as long as possible. Whereas a lot of other teams are playing a little bit more standard, where they're playing a 1-3-1. And this is what you're expecting in pugs. If you're playing a lot of pugs, you're expecting that 1-3-1, the player pushed up cat, the player aggressive in connector, and the opper in window. This has fallen a little bit out of favor, especially in the pro scene, because the smoke window essentially nullifies this opper and the rotation isn't perfect. So that's why you often see this kind of double up in towards con early round, even trying to fight for con control and make sure they don't, oftentimes when this happens, break this vent, because especially with the bench here at bottom mid, but even without the bench, boosting up into window has become pretty meta, pretty common, and if you have the vent broken, you have to have a player that's playing something like jungle holding onto windows so they can't go through. However, if the vent isn't broken, you can occasionally have this guy play an angle like this crazy type of angle, but oftentimes you'll see someone play something like this, where he can control that jungle push from the window player, likely get a kill if the guy's making his way over there, and they don't have to worry that this vent could be broken because you can essentially hear this vent being broken from across the universe. Really, it can be heard from like top middle or something like that. So the question is sometimes, do you break that vent or not? And if you're playing a 1-3-1, you're usually looking at breaking that vent, and that can sometimes make late rounds a little bit more complicated to deal with, and it can mean that things like boosting up into window and holding this angle here, waiting for that rifler to re-peek and check window that is almost certainly going to be coming. You have that happening, and you can definitely be isolated. Again, if that window vent is broken, it's very rare that this player isn't going to be re-peeking out and trying to clear this. So when it comes to mid control, again, 2 connector is fairly common. 1-3-1 is fairly common. A lot of teams are definitely liking to be boosting up here on this cat box very often as of recent and playing something like this. Sometimes they'll even play up the boost and then they'll have a player get into ladder and you have a bit of a double up on cat. There's lots of different ways this type of thing can be played. I can't really go through all of them, but the other option that teams are opting into quite often now is this more passive setup where you're kind of starting the round in what used to be the late round, because it used to be you would go from a 1-3-1 where this opper would eventually rotate his way back over to ticket, and the connector player would end up covering through window and jungle later. You're seeing teams sometimes start out rounds by playing like this. They have this opper up on ticket. He can kind of semi-control middle, and you have a fairly solid A hold as well as a reasonable mid hold, and you can try and get some information. You can try and play around this. It's just a passive and semi-safe way to hold on to the bomb sites without really giving up too much. It does mean you're a little bit weaker to something like a B split, but it's something teams often throw in that doesn't require them, again, to be breaking this vent all the time. And if you're not breaking the vent, it can be a little bit easier to be playing this type of setup where, again, you have the player jungle, player ticket, 2B, and the A player is often playing something like ramp corner, playing something like palace up on balcony, and just covering one of the 2 angles for the opper so the opper can focus a little bit on connector and a little bit on that angle, and just honestly kind of hope not to be timing at some point. But other than that, the more common things you're going to be seeing, kind of off plays that you may be seeing, something like the Astralis mid smoke and going for mid control with that is pretty common. That smoke toss deep in there, followed up by something like a Molotov behind it, and players pushing deep up into middle, hopefully with a Molotov that actually lands correctly instead of landing inside of the smoke, and you'll have control of middle off of that. The other thing people are doing quite often is something like I mentioned earlier, which is, doubling up a ramp for control, doubling up palace for a palace push, something like that, where you recognize that the T side is playing that 1-3-1, and that's where this kind of give and take in terms of meta shifting is really happening, because if you see a team that's running a 1-3-1 on the T side, you can try this type of double up a ramp push or the double up palace push, but if the T's respond with something like a 2-3-0, you can often be caught off by having them have 2 players there. And so there's a lot of kind of call it give and take, call it a lot of kind of gambling or a lot of just reading going on based on how teams are playing, how they're likely to play out the remainder of the half, and how you can try and counter that. Because there is, of course, the very classic B push utility. There's plenty of ways to throw this, but one of the ways I've seen recently to throw this is a Molotov like that, which lands standard B. You don't necessarily need that, but you can have something like the cat player throw this deep app smoke from there, and then you can have your B player throw a deep Molotov. With the deep Molotov, you can be going for deep control. And again, if you're not playing something like a B apartments player because you're doubling up on A this round, you're going to have no control and you're going to know it. You can also have, which is the more kind of gambly play, is having this opper that plays middle, or you might have a double op. Just come over here and hold this angle and just fully rotate off. You see a lot of teams do this nowadays as well. They have this opper hold down on this line, and they'll rotate off to stack on the A bomb site, knowing that it's somewhat unlikely if there was no player pressuring B or even looking at B, that they're probably not coming back, and you have early enough warning and notice that you can try and deal with that. Oftentimes this means they might be playing something like a 2-3-0 with nobody actually touching or even looking at the B side of the map. They're all just focused on the A side. So certainly lots of different things going on this map, lots of different ideas you can be looking at and playing against or with to try and deal with a lot of different setups. But when you're looking at, the standard B play, you're looking at usually a smoke off on apartments from the cat player, and this is kind of what you're seeing in Pugs. Again, I don't think the meta in this game or in this map in particular necessarily follows with the pro scene. I think the pro scene is adapting on this map quite quickly, quite aggressively, and the meta in Pugs is really kind of stagnant in this 1-3-1, and certainly something that can be abusable if you have semi-coordinated teammates playing against players that are playing this kind of Puggy style, where these types of B pops that I've mentioned, this type of kind of 2-3-0 idea that I mentioned, can really punish these teams that are really just kind of unready and unaware of how to deal with it. Now, I wanted to bring up how to play each of the bomb sites, but I actually have videos on that, and although they're on old cache, they're still pretty much relevant, so I'll go ahead and link those in the description if you want to have those. But in general, this is kind of the advanced ideas behind cache or behind Mirage, what you're really looking at and how you can try and deal with it. So thanks for watching, and I hope this helped.